They said I was just a tenant. I revealed I owned the entire building. The quiet tenant everyone ignored. They said he was just a tenant, and that was the first mistake they made. In a busy building where people judged quickly and spoke even faster, Sebastian Vale moved like someone who didn't belong to the noise. He lived in apartment 3B, a simple unit with plain walls, no expensive decorations, and nothing that could suggest power or wealth. To everyone watching, he looked like an ordinary man trying to survive another month. And in a world where appearances shaped respect, that made him invisible. This is how every underestimated man's story begins, with silence, with assumptions, and with people who think they already know the truth. Sebastian never corrected them. He paid his rent on time, spoke only when necessary, and carried himself with a calm that many mistook for weakness. But behind that calm was something else, something people couldn't see yet, a hidden owner, a man who understood that real power doesn't need to announce itself. Every morning, he walked past the front desk where Victor Crawford sat like a king in a place he didn't own. Victor was the kind of man who measured people by their clothes, their tone, and how much he believed they mattered. And to him, Sebastian Vale didn't matter at all. Another quiet one, Victor once said to Elena Brooks, the receptionist, barely lowering his voice. Probably struggling to keep up with rent. Elena didn't respond. She had noticed something different about Sebastian, something subtle but impossible to explain. Maybe it was the way he never rushed, or how he looked at people, not with fear, not with admiration, but with quiet understanding. Still, she said nothing. In buildings like this, people learn to stay in their place. That afternoon, Sebastian approached the desk. "I'd like to confirm my lease details," he said calmly. Victor didn't even look up immediately. He flipped through a stack of papers, pretending to search, stretching the moment just enough to remind Sebastian who he thought had the power. "Name?" Victor asked, though the file was already in front of him. "Sebastian Vale." Victor finally looked up, his eyes scanning Sebastian like he was something easy to dismiss. "Everything seems basic," he said with a slight smirk. "You sure you can keep up with payments?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement disguised as one, a quiet insult wrapped in authority. A few people in the lobby turned to watch. Moments like this were small, but they carried weight. This was how reputations were shaped, through tone, through disrespect, through public assumptions. Sebastian didn't react. He didn't defend himself, didn't argue, didn't try to prove anything. Instead, he simply nodded. "Everything will be handled," he replied. His voice was steady, controlled, almost too calm for the situation. Victor leaned back in his chair, unimpressed. "We'll see," he said. That phrase lingered in the air longer than it should have. "We'll see." It sounded like a challenge, like a line drawn between someone who believed he had authority and someone he believed had none. But what Victor didn't understand was that this wasn't a tenant versus landlord story. This wasn't about rent, or rules, or control. This was something else entirely. Something bigger. Sebastian turned and walked away, his steps quiet, his expression unchanged. But as he moved through the hallway, past doors that held stories of people who thought they understood their world, there was a shift, small, invisible, but real. Because moments like this don't disappear. They build. They stack. They create something waiting beneath the surface. This was more than just a building. It was a system of assumptions, of authority built on incomplete knowledge, of people who believed power looked a certain way. And Sebastian Vale didn't look like power. That was his greatest advantage. Later that evening, as the sun dipped and the building grew quieter, Sebastian sat alone in his apartment. The room was simple, but his mind was anything but. He looked at a set of documents resting neatly on the table, papers that told a very different story from the one everyone believed. A story of ownership, of control, of decisions made long before anyone in that building had formed an opinion about him. This wasn't just a hidden owner reveal waiting to happen. This was a carefully controlled narrative, a power reversal story that would unfold at the right time, not out of emotion, but out of precision. Sebastian picked up his phone and made a single call. "It's time to begin," he said quietly. There was no anger in his voice. No need for it. Because real power doesn't react. It responds when the moment is right. And as the call ended, one thing became clear. The people who underestimated him weren't just wrong. They were about to learn a lesson they wouldn't forget. A lesson about respect, about perception, and about the danger of judging a man before understanding his position. This wasn't just another story. This was a shocking identity reveal, a rich man in disguise, a moment where everything people believed would be turned upside down. And if you're enjoying this kind of powerful, emotional storytelling, make sure you subscribe, like this story, and stay with me, because what's coming next will change everything. The disrespect that built the storm. In buildings like this, disrespect doesn't arrive all at once. It grows slowly, quietly, in small moments that most people ignore. But for an underestimated man, those moments become something else. They become evidence. They become fuel. And in this power reversal story, every action taken against Sebastian Vale was building towards something no one saw coming. After his calm exchange with Victor Crawford, things didn't improve. If anything, they became worse, more deliberate, more public. Victor had made up his mind about Sebastian, and once a man like him decides who you are, he rarely looks again. To him, Sebastian was just another tenant trying to hold on, someone easy to control, someone who wouldn't push back. That assumption would soon become his greatest mistake. It started with small delays. A maintenance request Sebastian submitted for a leaking pipe was ignored for days. When he followed up, Victor barely glanced at him. "You'll have to wait," he said coldly. "There are more important units to handle." More important units. The words carried weight. They told everyone listening exactly where Sebastian stood in Victor's eyes. Below others. Less valuable. Easy to dismiss. A few tenants standing nearby exchanged looks. Some felt uncomfortable, others simply accepted it. In places like this, people often stay quiet, even when they know something isn't right. That silence is what allows disrespect to grow. But Sebastian didn't argue. He simply nodded and walked away, just like before. Calm. Controlled. Observing. Because this wasn't just a tenant versus landlord story. This was a hidden owner reveal slowly taking shape, and every moment mattered. As days passed, the pattern became clear. Packages addressed to Sebastian were delayed or misplaced. His access to certain building facilities was suddenly restricted. Even his parking spot was reassigned without warning. When he approached Victor about it, the response was immediate and sharp. "If you have a problem, you're free to leave," Victor said, loud enough for others to hear. The lobby fell silent for a moment. This was no longer subtle. This was open disrespect. Public. Intentional. Designed to remind Sebastian of his supposed position. Elena Brooks watched from behind the desk, her expression tense. She had seen many tenants come and go, but something about this situation felt different. Sebastian wasn't reacting the way most people would. There was no frustration, no raised voice, no attempt to defend himself. Just that same quiet composure. It didn't feel like weakness. It felt like patience. Dangerous patience. Victor leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled but still cutting. "People like you don't last long in places like this," he said. "You should find somewhere cheaper before it becomes a problem." A few soft chuckles came from the side. Not everyone agreed, but no one stepped in. That's how authority works when it's unchecked. It doesn't need to be right, it just needs to be loud enough to be believed. Sebastian looked at Victor for a brief moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke. "I'll stay." 2 simple words. No emotion. No explanation. But something about the way he said it made Elena pause. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't desperation. It was certainty. And certainty like that doesn't come from someone without options. Victor smirked, shaking his head. "We'll see how long that lasts," he replied. That phrase again. "We'll see." But this time, it didn't carry the same power. Because something had shifted, even if only slightly. Later that evening, as the building settled into its usual rhythm, Sebastian walked through the hallway with the same steady pace. People passed him without much thought, still seeing what they expected to see, an ordinary man, a quiet tenant, someone with no real influence. But appearances can be dangerously misleading. Inside his apartment, Sebastian placed a folder on the table. Inside were records, dates, times, actions, conversations. Every delay, every restriction, every moment of disrespect had been documented with precision. This wasn't emotional. This wasn't personal. This was preparation. Because a shocking identity reveal is only powerful when it is supported by undeniable truth. This was no longer just about how he was treated. It was about what that treatment revealed. About a system built on assumptions. About a man in authority who never questioned his own position. About how easily people mistake silence for weakness. Sebastian sat down, flipping through the pages slowly. Each one told part of the story, a story that was moving steadily toward its turning point. A rich man in disguise doesn't reveal himself too early. He waits. He watches. He allows others to show who they really are. And Victor Crawford was doing exactly that. With every decision, every careless word, every public display of control, he was exposing himself without even realizing it. That is the nature of power when it is built on arrogance. It blinds you to the truth standing right in front of you. Sebastian picked up his phone again, his expression unchanged. "Everything is in place," he said calmly. There was a brief pause on the other end. "Good," came the reply. "Then we proceed." The call ended. Outside, the building stood as it always had, solid, structured, seemingly unchanged. But beneath that surface, something was building. Something quiet, controlled, and inevitable. This wasn't just a revenge story without violence. This was something sharper. A lesson. A shift. A moment where authority would be exposed, where assumptions would collapse, and where respect would no longer be optional. And the most dangerous part? No one saw it coming. Not Victor. Not the tenants. Not even the ones who sensed something was different. Because the strongest moves are the ones made in silence. And Sebastian Vale had just made his. The arrival that changed everything. The morning felt ordinary, and that was exactly why no one was ready for what was about to happen. In stories like this, the biggest turning points don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, slipping into the same routine everyone trusts, and then they break it completely. For days, the tension in the building had been growing, even if most people couldn't explain why. The air carried something unspoken, something building beneath the surface. This was no longer just an underestimated man's story. This was the moment where the hidden owner reveal would begin to unfold. Sebastian Vale stepped out of apartment 3B just like he always did, calm, composed, and unnoticed. He walked past other tenants who barely acknowledged him, past doors that held opinions already formed about who he was. To them, he was still the same quiet man, the same ordinary tenant, the same person they had already decided wasn't important. But today, that belief was about to be tested. Downstairs, Victor Crawford sat behind the desk, scrolling through his phone with the same careless confidence. To him, the building was under control. Every tenant had a place, every rule had a voice, and he was the one enforcing it. Authority, in his mind, was simple. You speak, others follow. And people like Sebastian Vale? They stay quiet and accept their position. That belief had never been challenged. Until now. At exactly 10:15 in the morning, a black car pulled up outside the building. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it didn't belong to the usual pattern of deliveries or visitors. It carried a presence that didn't match the building's everyday rhythm. A few tenants near the entrance noticed it first. "Who's that?" someone whispered. The car door opened, and two men stepped out, both dressed in sharp, clean suits that immediately set them apart. They didn't look around like visitors trying to find their way. They walked with purpose, with direction, like they already knew exactly where they were going. This wasn't random. This was planned. Inside, Elena Brooks looked up from her desk as the doors opened. She felt it instantly, that shift again, stronger this time. The kind of shift that tells you something important is about to happen. The two men walked straight toward the desk. Victor barely looked up at first, already prepared to dismiss them like he did with most people. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone flat, uninterested. One of the men stepped forward slightly. "We're here to see Mr. Sebastian Vale," he said. Victor let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "The tenant," he replied, almost amused. The word tenant rolled off his tongue with the same dismissive edge he always used. It was automatic now, a label he had repeated so often that it had become truth in his mind. But the man didn't react. "Yes," he said calmly. "The owner." The word landed differently. It didn't echo loudly, but it carried weight. Real weight. The kind that doesn't need volume to be heard. For a moment, everything paused. Victor blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "I'm sorry," he said, his tone shifting slightly, confusion replacing confidence. Before the man could repeat himself, the front door opened again. Sebastian Vale walked in. Same pace. Same calm expression. Same simple appearance. Nothing about him had changed. And yet, everything had. The two men immediately straightened slightly. Not dramatically, not exaggerated, but enough to signal recognition. Respect. A quiet kind of respect that doesn't need explanation. "Mr. Vale," one of them said. Victor's eyes moved between them, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This didn't fit his understanding of the world. This didn't match the story he had already written about Sebastian. "What is this?" Victor asked, his voice no longer as steady as before. Sebastian didn't answer immediately. He simply walked past the desk, his presence now carrying something that had always been there but never noticed. Control. Not loud, not forced, just natural. This was the moment where the tenant versus landlord story began to collapse. Because the roles were never what they seemed. Elena watched closely, her eyes fixed on Sebastian. Now it made sense. The calm. The patience. The silence. It wasn't weakness. It was awareness. It was a man who already knew the outcome, long before anyone else realized there was even a game being played. Victor stood up from his chair, his movements slightly tense. "You need to explain what's going on," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. But control was already slipping. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. Just enough to feel it. And once that feeling starts, it's hard to ignore. Sebastian turned slightly, his gaze meeting Victor's for the first time without distance. "Everything will be explained," he said. The same words he had used before. But this time, they carried a different meaning. A different weight. Because now, they weren't coming from someone being questioned. They were coming from someone who had the answers. This was the beginning of the shocking identity reveal. The moment where assumptions begin to break, where authority is questioned, where the truth starts to surface. Outside, the building remained the same. People moved in and out, unaware of what was unfolding inside. But within those walls, something had already shifted. A rich man in disguise had stepped fully into the light, not by changing who he was, but by allowing the truth to catch up with him. And for Victor Crawford, the man who believed he understood power, this was the moment everything started to unravel. Because the most dangerous realization isn't losing control. It's discovering you never had it in the first place. The truth no one could deny. The office door closed softly, but the sound echoed like something final. Inside that room, everything that had been assumed, ignored, and misunderstood was about to be brought into the light. This was not just another conversation. This was the moment the hidden owner reveal would become undeniable. The air felt heavier, tighter, like the building itself was holding its breath. Victor Crawford stood near the desk, his posture stiff, his confidence no longer steady. Across from him, Sebastian Vale sat calmly, his presence unchanged, as if nothing unusual was happening. But everything was different now. This was no longer a tenant versus landlord story. The roles had shifted, and the truth was about to rewrite everything Victor believed. Charles Whitaker stepped forward and placed a folder neatly on the desk. His movements were precise, controlled, the kind that come from someone used to dealing with serious matters. "All documents are here," he said, his voice clear and professional. Victor hesitated before stepping closer. His eyes moved to the folder, then to Sebastian, then back again. Something in him resisted opening it, as if he already knew that whatever was inside would destroy the version of reality he had been holding on to. "Go ahead," Sebastian said quietly. There was no pressure in his voice, no urgency. Just certainty. Victor reached out and opened the folder. The first page was clean, official, unmistakable. His eyes scanned the lines quickly at first, then slower, then again, as if repetition might change what he was seeing. But it didn't. It couldn't. Ownership records. Legal confirmation. Dates going back years. Everything aligned. Everything complete. Everything undeniable. This doesn't make sense," Victor said, his voice lower now, strained. "It does," Charles Whitaker replied calmly. "You just never asked the right questions." Silence filled the room again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of realization. Heavy, unavoidable realization. This was the shocking identity reveal, the moment where the truth stands in front of you and refuses to move. Victor looked up slowly, his eyes locking onto Sebastian. "You're telling me, you own this building?" he asked, each word carrying disbelief. Sebastian met his gaze without hesitation. "I've always owned it," he said. No emotion. No need to prove anything further. The truth was already doing that. Victor stepped back slightly, as if the distance might help him process what was happening. But there was no distance from this kind of reality. It follows you. It stays. It forces you to confront it. Every word he had spoken, every decision he had made, every moment of disrespect replayed in his mind with a new meaning. The delays. The insults. The public comments. They weren't directed at a powerless tenant. They were directed at the one person who had the authority to change everything. This was more than just a power reversal story. This was exposure. Pure, clear exposure. Sebastian leaned forward slightly, his hands resting calmly on the table. "I chose to stay unnoticed," he said. "I wanted to understand how things were being managed." His voice remained steady, but now there was something else beneath it. Not anger. Not frustration. Just clarity. "And what I found was a system built on assumptions," he continued. "A system where respect was given based on appearance, not truth." Victor tried to speak, but the words didn't come easily. The confidence he once carried had been replaced by something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. "I didn't know," he finally said. It was the only defense he had left. But it wasn't enough. Sebastian shook his head slightly. "That's the problem," he replied. "You didn't try to know." The words landed harder than anything else. Because they weren't loud. They were accurate. And accuracy leaves no room for escape. This was the lesson at the center of every underestimated man story. It's not just about being wrong. It's about choosing not to look deeper. Choosing to judge quickly. Choosing to believe that what you see is all that exists. Sebastian reached into the folder and pulled out another set of documents. "Every complaint, every delay, every action taken under your authority has been recorded," he said. Victor's eyes widened slightly. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected the silence to be watching him. "This isn't about revenge," Sebastian added. "This is about accountability. A revenge story without violence doesn't need chaos to be powerful. It needs truth. And truth, when presented correctly, is impossible to ignore. Outside the office, a few tenants had started to gather, their curiosity growing. Word was spreading, slowly but steadily. Something was happening. Something important. Elena stood near the door, her expression focused. She didn't need to hear every word. She already understood. The quiet man they had all underestimated was not what he seemed. He never was. Inside, Victor lowered himself into the chair, his energy drained. "What happens now?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried everything. Fear. Uncertainty. Realization. Sebastian stood up slowly, his movements calm and deliberate. "Now," he said, "things are corrected. No threats. No raised voice. Just a statement of fact. Because real authority doesn't need to announce itself. It simply acts." This was the moment the rich man in disguise was fully revealed, not through appearance, but through truth. The building hadn't changed. The people hadn't changed. But the understanding of power had. And once that understanding shifts, nothing goes back to the way it was. Victor looked down at the documents one last time, as if hoping for something to change. But nothing did. Because the truth doesn't adjust itself to protect your ego. It stands, solid and unmovable, waiting for you to accept it. And in that office, in that quiet but powerful moment, everything Victor believed about control, authority, and respect collapsed completely. The power everyone finally understood. By the next morning, the building felt different, even though nothing about it had physically changed. The walls were the same, the hallways were the same, and the people were the same, but the energy had shifted completely. This is what happens when truth replaces assumption. This is what happens when a hidden owner reveal turns into a reality no one can ignore. The news had spread faster than anyone expected. Tenants whispered in corners, exchanged looks in the hallway, and spoke in low voices that carried a mix of shock and realization. "He owns the entire building," someone asked. "Sebastian Vale," another replied, still trying to process it. The underestimated man's story had reached its turning point, and now everyone was seeing it clearly. The man they had overlooked, ignored, and quietly judged was not just another tenant. He was the authority they never recognized. Downstairs, a notice had been placed at the front desk early that morning. It was simple, clean, and direct. Management restructuring effective immediately. Victor Crawford is no longer in charge of this property. There were no dramatic explanations, no emotional statements, no unnecessary details. Just truth, presented the same way Sebastian had handled everything else, calm, precise, and final. Victor arrived later than usual, his steps slower, his presence no longer commanding. The same people who once stayed silent now watched him differently. Not with fear, not with respect, but with awareness. Because authority built on assumption doesn't survive exposure. He approached the desk and saw the notice. For a moment, he just stood there, reading it over and over, as if repetition might soften the meaning. But it didn't. It couldn't. This was the consequence. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just clear. Elena Brooks stood nearby, her expression steady. She didn't say anything, and she didn't need to. The situation spoke for itself. This was never just a tenant versus landlord story. It was a lesson about perception, about respect, and about the danger of thinking you understand someone without truly seeing them. Victor turned slowly, his eyes scanning the lobby, meeting faces that no longer avoided his gaze. For the first time, he understood what it felt like to be seen differently. Not because he changed, but because the truth had been revealed. And sometimes, that is the most powerful shift of all. At that same moment, the front doors opened, and Sebastian Vale walked in. Just like every other day, his appearance hadn't changed. Simple clothes, calm expression, quiet steps. But now, everything about him carried meaning. Conversations stopped. Movements slowed. People who once ignored him now stepped aside, giving him space without being asked. Respect had arrived, not because he demanded it, but because it was finally understood. This is the core of every power reversal story. The moment when silence becomes authority, when patience becomes strength, and when truth becomes undeniable. Sebastian didn't pause for attention. He didn't acknowledge the whispers or the stares. He simply walked through the lobby, the same way he always had. Because real power doesn't need performance. It doesn't change when people start watching. It remains consistent. That consistency is what makes it real. Olivia Hart, one of the tenants who had quietly observed everything, stepped forward slightly. "Good morning," she said, her voice respectful. Sebastian nodded. "Good morning." Two simple words, but now they carried a different weight. Not because he changed, but because she understood. That's the difference. Respect isn't created. It's realized. Inside the office, new documents were being arranged, new systems being reviewed, and new standards being set. Not out of revenge, but out of correction. Because a revenge story without violence is not about destroying people. It's about restoring balance. It's about showing that actions have consequences, even when they seem small at the time. Every delay Victor caused, every dismissive comment, every moment of public disrespect had led to this outcome. Not because Sebastian reacted emotionally, but because he responded strategically. That is the difference between temporary power and real authority. One reacts. The other waits, observes, and acts at the right time. As the day continued, the building began to settle into a new rhythm. One built on awareness instead of assumption. People spoke more carefully. They paid more attention. They looked beyond appearances. Because once you witness a shocking identity reveal, you don't see things the same way again. Later that evening, Sebastian stood near the entrance, looking out at the city. The same city that had watched him walk quietly, unnoticed, underestimated. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. Because this was never about proving a point. It was about revealing the truth. A rich man in disguise doesn't need recognition. He understands that power is not in being seen. It's in being effective. And effectiveness doesn't need applause. Before stepping out, he paused for a brief moment, his voice calm but clear. "Respect is not about position," he said softly. "It's about how you treat people when you think they have none." Those words stayed in the air long after he left. Because they weren't just part of a story. They were a lesson. A real one. And if you've enjoyed this powerful, emotional storytelling, make sure you subscribe, like this story, and comment where you are watching from. Because stories like this don't just entertain, they remind us that the person you underestimate today might be the one who changes everything tomorrow.